Hey listeners, this is Mike Morford, co-host of Missing Persons, and I want to tell you about a great podcast called Mayhem with Michele McPhee from Storic Media. On Mayhem, you'll join investigative journalist and author Michele McPhee as she uncovers some of the biggest stories in true crime. You can listen to her exclusive coverage on stories such as the Boston Marathon bombings, to the latest news and breaking crimes hitting the nation. You can dive deep into these true crime stories by visiting mayhempod.com. I'm going to play a preview episode of Mayhem, in which Michele McPhee talks to her friend and co-host of the hot new true crime podcast, Marginalized Murder, about the 20-year murder spree in Chicago that has been grossly underreported. They also talk about the DNA backlog and the role of journalism in spurring legislation. After you listen to this preview, be sure to subscribe to Mayhem with Michele McPhee. And for more information about the show, don't forget to head over to mayhempod.com. Enjoy this preview, and we'll see you back here soon.
And in my mind, I'm thinking she received a phone call from a man, and now she's leaving to meet him. And how can she choose this person over me at this time? So that's what I was thinking when she was walking in the building. I didn't think that that would be my last time seeing her alive.
Less than 24 hours after that mysterious phone call, the Williams family's lives would change forever. On June 12, 2002, Gwendolyn Williams' lifeless body was discovered lying in a grassy area behind a dollar store. She was only 40 years old.
And joining me now is the creator of that amazing podcast, my friend, Carly Sullivan Rowland. She is really, truly a kaleidoscopic human. She's an actress. She is a journalist. She's a podcaster, and she's about to become a documentary filmmaker, I truly believe, based on the extensive work that goes into something this dramatic. 51. That number is staggering. And what was done about it? Probably nothing until Carly came along and decided to shine a light on this extraordinary story of 51 missing women of color in Chicago. The title of this podcast, I think, is spot on, Marginalized Murder, because these are women who have existed in the shadows largely. These are women that no one was truly trying to find until you have somebody who's willing to do the work, to dig into the case, and to take these families seriously. And that's exactly what Carly Sullivan Rowland has done with Marginalized Murder. And I am so happy that she is able to join me right now here on Mayhem with Michele McPhee. Carly, it's so good to see you. Well, I was so happy that you are getting such great press in Chicago for this because it's a very important story. And I think there should be a national story. In fact, you and I have talked about it. I think there needs to be national legislation.
Absolutely.
That is provoked by this piece of journalism.
Yeah. Well, first off, going back to your point about making it national news, that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, is because while it has been covered here and there in Chicago over the last few years, every single person who has tuned in has gone, I cannot believe this story. I had no idea. And so that is an indicator to me that while, yes, maybe people in the local community and folks working on this case know about the story, most people across the country have no idea that the largest active serial murder case potentially exists in Chicago today. And so my hope is that this podcast continues to spread, that people continue to hear the story and awareness is made, and the national news correspondents pick up on this and decide to do an extensive story. That is my.
And more importantly, Congress. Congress needs to be involved, because talk to us a little bit about the patterns that were created in this case, which are so important in any murder investigation. You don't hear it often anymore, but patterns and the creation of patterns are so critical to it's a critical law enforcement tool to solving a number of crimes. But especially in this case, this is something that could have been prevented if the patterns had been shared jurisdictionally.
Yes. And it's interesting because I know when I talked to you about this story months ago, you talked about criminology and patterns. And I said, oh, wow. Okay. Michele understands and knows, but it's something that even I had no awareness of until I really dove in and investigated the story starting in 2020. And so what is unique about this case is that an algorithm, a novel, unique algorithm created by a man named Thomas Hargrove, who is the founder of the Murder Accountability Project, actually pointed to this cluster of murders in Chicago. The algorithm, which many of you have probably heard about algorithms because nowadays they're used for everything, right? Social media, investment banking, dating apps. That's how I met my husband, was an algorithm.
Lucky you, because you have a good one. That's for sure.
It was a 1 in a million chance, but he decided, he said, what if I can take an algorithm? And this was back in 2010. And he said, what if I can find and utilize it to pinpoint clusters of serial murder? And he refined it, and by using the cluster analysis technique, actually was able to start indicating based on other proven patterns. He used the Green River Killer as a reference to see, okay, can I take these victims and will my algorithm pull them up? And it did. And so over the last decade, he has been refining it. And the Murder Accountability Project now has this algorithm, which will pinpoint areas across the country with clusters of likely serial murder activity. And what Hargrove discovered, I believe it was back in 2014, he discovered this cluster in Chicago, and the cluster was growing. And he went to the Chicago PD with he had a 9-page, I believe it was a 9-page report about this cluster in Chicago of women, all of whom had been strangled to death over the last 20 years. Most of their homicides had not been solved. This was a very, very large cold case, which Hargrove told me is extremely rare to be this large. And so essentially, yes, this algorithm.
Growing. And growing. From
and
2014, when he identified this cluster,
yes.
People still did not take action.
No.
And sadly, that number continued to climb.
Yes, all the way up until, we believe, 2018. Now, here's the deal. The reality is there are at least 51 women. I say at least because Hargrove and many people involved in this case believe it's more like 75 victims. And so we don't actually know how many women. We know at least 51, but we believe that there are more. And so, yes, had something been done, had this pattern been, seen, and had the idea of perhaps linkage blindness, which prevents police from seeing serial activity, murders, and connections, had they known it, had they seen it, perhaps this wouldn't have happened, or at least not as many women had to die.
Well, and this is why it needs to be a federal issue, because every local department, the Chicago PD is concentrating on their own clearance rates. So if there's a cluster that happens outside of their jurisdiction, outside of their precinct, then they're not as motivated to take on that responsibility, which is why it's critical that the feds take a very hard look at this and create a team to identify clusters and to investigate them, which isn't happening right now.
Yes, it's something that I learned in investigating the case. Hargrove told me about this idea and concept of linkage blindness, which you have actually talked to me about as well, which is exactly that unless police are talking about it over the water cooler, that an investigator in one jurisdiction solving and working on one case might not know that the same perpetrator is involved in another case in a different county or a different jurisdiction. And so because they're not communicating, connected crimes go unconnected. And criminologists actually believe that most connected crimes do end up going unconnected because of this concept called linkage blindness. It is real. Criminologists, again, have been studying it for decades, and there doesn't really seem to be anything in the works to help resolve it, which is exactly why I agree with you that there needs to be some sort of national legislature that is put into action to really resolve this. And that is a part of our platform. So one thing that we are doing with the podcast, I say we meaning myself and some of the local activists, state politicians like Senator Patricia Van Pelt, we are working together to use this podcast as a platform because this is by far the most extensive storytelling around this case. And we would like to take this and start enacting legislative changes locally and hopefully nationally. And so we're going to actually have a meeting next week, thanks to you, Michele, because you told me weeks ago, you said you need to do something about this. And at the time I was like, okay, I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm a writer, I'm a producer. I'm not, this is not my area, but I brought the idea to some of the team members and we're moving forward with that.
Congratulations. And that's what good journalism is.
Yes.
Journalism, and it's why it's so critically important. Investigative journalism is what sparks change.
Absolutely.
And accountability. And it seems like both of those linkage blindness, both of those issues, I think, are how so many bodies started to fall at the hands of one, perhaps, serial killer. It's because we have this blindness and it needs to change. And the only way it's going to change is if people are held accountable. This is not finger pointing. No one's saying the Chicago PD did a bad job. We're saying that the system, the way that it exists today, doesn't work, we need an overhaul of that system. And it's a very easy fix. Create a national task force dedicated to cluster crimes nationwide.
Absolutely. That is exactly the point where sometimes I think, there's so much content to consume nowadays and there are so many stories and so many important stories. And I agree that sometimes you'll hear a story and then you feel helpless. What can I do? What should I do? And I know for myself as a storyteller, I was starting to kind of feel that way as I was wrapping up the podcast. And I realized, change comes from individuals saying, we're going to come together collectively and do something about this. And so, yes, I think that the story is incredibly important, but now it's all about taking action. And so that is what the next step entails, is taking action. And so
everyone needs to take action. You can call your own lawmaker. When you listen to marginalized murder, you'll be outraged. You'll be infuriated, like I usually am. I'm kind of in a constant state of outrage. But that outrage, honestly, you can use it to motivate yourself and to call your own national lawmakers. Find out who your congressman or woman is.
Absolutely.
Find out who your senator is and call them. Embarrass them. The only thing these politicians ever respond to it, I am talking about this in a completely apolitical way. Both sides of the aisle, they respond to public humiliation and being called out.
Yes.
And that means you tweet at them. Why aren't you doing anything about the serial killer in Chicago?
Mm-hmm.
You say, why don't we have a national task force? And one person making a phone call, 10 people tweeting, 100 people retweeting. You would be surprised how quickly you will get a response when you call people out on their nonsense and their inactivity.
And speaking of that, I just want to give you an example of how powerful that is from this story. So I don't want to give it away because only right now, I believe episode 2 came out. So I'm like, eek.
I don't want to give away the story either because I know a little bit more.
Because it's so multi-layered, right? And so every single episode is this new sort of jaw-dropping information that not only talks about the victims and what happened in their cases, but also, for example, DNA testing, backlogs, things of that nature that are beyond shocking. And the local activists in this story, and I'm going to call them out specifically that I worked with, the organization Mothers Opposed to Violence Everywhere, Reverend Robin Hood, who is a massive ally of mine, and his wife, Lavinia Hood. The collective work that they did together in this case when they found out about the massive DNA backlog in the state of Illinois and how they rallied together to get their local politician, Senator Patricia Van Pelt, to do something about it was phenomenal work. Without their help.
And they did it.
And they did it.
They did it.
They did it. Without them, there was at least 10,000 DNA samples that had not been tested. 10,000. There was a massive decade-long backlog.
That's so unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, sadly, the story in so many crime labs, accredited, non-accredited. there's such a backlog of DNA, never mind fingerprints. It's absolutely unacceptable that we don't have a more boisterous overhaul of the crime lab system in every major city, because that's the case in Boston. It's the case in New York. It's probably the case in LA. Mm-hmm. But those backlog stories, I've been a reporter for decades, and I've probably done 200 stories on backlogs that never change.
Wow. Yeah. And so the point is, if you are, or if you're wanting change, you can be a part of the change, because that is exactly what I discovered in this story. And I was quite frankly, inspired, because I realized, I was like, there are people out there who care and dedicate their lives or any free time that they might have to being a part of that change. And I saw that with the community activists here, and they had made some of these key issues in the case go away, like the DNA backlog. Is there still a backlog in Illinois? There is, but it is moving. And I want to say there's maybe now 1,000 DNA samples that have not been tested, but there was 10,000 only 4 years ago. So
amazing. That's remarkable work.
It's remarkable work. And that's the point, is that it all matters. This story matters. The listeners matter, because you, like Michele said, you can call your local lawmakers. You can donate. We have links on our website on storicmedia.com. On the podcast, I give you the links to where you could donate to Mothers Opposed to Violence Everywhere. You can donate to the Murder Accountability Project. You can donate to the people and organizations doing the work.
So tell me one personal story of one of the 51 women. And I'm sure there's so many that stick in your mind. But for me, there's always one story that drives me to get to the truth or to, spur action. There's one story. Is there a woman in this collection that does that for you?
Oh, God. And it's really hard, as you said, to kind of narrow it down, but there is normally one. I would probably have to say one of the victims whose sister I spoke with in the podcast. The victim's name was Gwendolyn Williams. She was strangled to death in 2000. Her body was dumped behind a 99-cent store. And I speak to Sharon Pritchard, her youngest sister. And I think what really struck me about Gwendolyn's murder, outside of the fact that, she was truly a beloved woman who was a light in the world, was the fact that, going back to the DNA testing, that there was ample DNA evidence in her case. There was DNA found inside her body, on her body, and in a sock next to her body. And despite all of that DNA evidence, it went untested for over a decade. And her sister, Dr. Sharon Pritchard, had to push for that DNA to get tested in 2018. She had to actually contact a senator in Illinois and say, why is my sister's DNA just sitting on a shelf? Do you guys even care about my sister? Do you care that she was murdered? Do you care that my sister was a human being? Thanks to Sharon, the DNA finally got tested. There was a CODIS hit. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but despite a direct DNA connection to a perpetrator, potential suspect, he has never been prosecuted. The DA refused to prosecute him. They said they didn't have enough evidence. And he still is roaming the streets. We do not know where he is. He was last seen in Tampa, Florida. And that case stood out to me because,
they had probable cause,
right,
at the very least, to present this case to a grand jury.
Right. They didn't, apparently, because of a 2016 ruling in a case called, and I'm going to botch the name of the case, but it was called the escort case. A case in Chicago happened. A woman was murdered, very similar circumstances to Gwendolyn, and there was DNA found in her body. But the DNA that was tied back to the gentleman, the court said that, well, he might have had sex with her, but it doesn't prove that he killed her.
Well, the John is still committing a crime, so it's still probable cause to investigate the homicide that's connected to the DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that really stood out to me because,
that's nonsense. That's an excuse. It really doesn't. Doesn't it boggle the mind when the DA refuses to do its job?
Well, and, Sharon had a good point. She's like, if my sister was white, if my sister was the daughter of, like a lawyer, a well-known judge, this guy would be in jail for life.
And that's why Marginalized Murder is the podcast. And trust me, as someone who's been a member of the media for a very long time, it is not an exaggeration or a stretch to suggest that this case got a lower priority because of her skin color.
That is absolutely right. In this story, out of at least 51 victims, 76% of them are African American. A majority of them have backgrounds that are deemed high-risk lifestyles, right? And so these are women who were probably victims of bullying, of a domestic abuse, who dealt with, very difficult upbringing and circumstances. And because of that, when they were murdered, I believe they potentially paid a price. And that price was the fact that they were not given the attention and the proper investigatory work needed. Not in all cases, but, in many of them. In many of them, there were not DNA samples collected. For example, back to Gwendolyn Williams' case, the police didn't properly investigate a phone call that she had received the night before she was found dead that her sister believes was very important to her case.
And in 2000, they had the technology to triangulate the cell phone towers in the area to see who was using their cell phone around the time of her death. So that's just lazy and shoddy police work.
Right. And so you're going to see a lot of that throughout this case. And again, I am not pointing fingers. I'm not blaming. I'm not suggesting. I let the people involved in this story do the storytelling. And so you can make your own judgment on how these cases were handled or not handled. But in my opinion, yes, I do believe that because of the fact that they're from the South and West Side of Chicago, that they are perhaps living a high-risk lifestyle, that they are, of color, that this case happened because of those circumstances and went on for decades because of those circumstances, because they were not a Gabby Petito.
Correct. And we've seen it over and over. We saw it, in the Northwest with the disappearances of so many Native American women that just went completely ignored for a very long time and continues to this day.
Yes. And, it's interesting because many people have been like, why did you decide to do this? Right. And so I am a white woman. I do not come from that type of background. I don't know what it's like. I don't even dare to pretend that I know what it's like. But I am a woman. I am a human being. And I have dealt with tragic loss in my life. And so I have empathy. I know what it's like to lose someone that you love deeply, suddenly and violently. I know, I understand. And so I don't care what background you come from. I just know that your story is important because you are a human being. And as a storyteller, and I don't know, you might feel the same way, Michele, there is no longer a luxury to not tell these stories. Meaning there is so much going on in the world and within our country right now. We do not have the luxury as storytellers to not do this work. And that's how I feel. And that's why I was driven to tell these stories, because I do not care what background this woman or these women came from, and nor should you. It is an epidemic. The Senate had a meeting this year because missing and murdered BIPOC women is an actual epidemic. That's how bad things are. Luckily, the Violence Against Women Act was reinstated recently by President Joe Biden, but many people also say that's still not enough, because domestic violence against women and murders of women is substantial. I'm nervous. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I lived in New York for a decade, but currently today in 2022, I am nervous walking the streets of Los Angeles. I'm constantly like, you know what? Somebody might abduct me. Somebody might murder me. And that's not an exaggeration.
Well, it's LA. Look around. We could get dragged into any of these tents that are lining the streets anywhere in
Exactly.
the neighborhood we're in right this minute.
Even right outside of the studio where we are right now.
Correct.
I am constantly on high alert. I'm constantly deciding, can I go to this place? Can I go there after dark? Like, I don't even feel comfortable going to the grocery store after dusk anymore. And I tell my husband, I'm like, if we need to get something, you have to go. I never used to live my life like that. And it's a shame.
Well, doing these sort of stories do mess with your psyche a little bit.
Yeah.
You're talking about death
for
so long, and you're investigating, and people's your empathy impacts you. You can't help but start to take on a little bit of the pain that people are feeling when you're involved so intimately in a story like this.
Yeah.
So it definitely impacts you. But if you didn't tell the story, who would? This has been happening. For how long?
20 years. It's, I believe, last year was maybe the 20-year anniversary. 2001 was, Angela Ford was our first victim in 2001. So 21 years. And yeah, I do feel that way. Again, Chicago, some of the local news outlets have covered this story. As I said, people started to take note of this case around 2017. But nothing has extensively been done. And that's why I really wanted to do this 7-part series. My 8th episode is actually a bonus episode with you. But I really wanted to do a deep dive into this case in a way that it has yet to be done, because there are so many layers to the storytelling. It's not just, again, about this potentially being the largest active serial murder case in the country involving perhaps 3 serial killers. It's not just about that. It's about the social, judicial, and criminal injustices that have occurred in this story. And so it's very complex. It's multi-layered, multifaceted. And I wanted to give that 360 view of what this story is really about.
And you've done an extraordinary job doing it. I really admire the work that you've done. People are not willing to put in the kind of, it's old school shoe leather street reporting, and people don't do it anymore. And so I give you the highest kudos.
Thank you
for pulling off the real work of investigative reporting, and investigative reporting that is provoking change. And that's the most important part of Marginalized Murder, which you can catch anywhere that you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Go to storicmedia.com, and you have to, you know what I love about your piece, and frankly, I think that we do a good job at Storic of presenting the facts that back our story.
Yes, I completely agree. And a shout out to Storic for really supporting female storytellers like ourselves and women who are really willing to get down and dirty in the investigatory world, because again, there is so much fluff out there. And I really think that, like you said, you and I take this serious. Like, this is as important to me as if my family member was one of these victims. And I really appreciate that compliment, Michele, because coming from someone like you with your background, that means the world. So yes, thank you.
Well, think about the algorithm actually kind of, in a million ways brought us all together.
Yeah. Yes. It's 360, this algorithm, and it's fascinating. I'm telling you, once you tune into the first 2 episodes where I really break down the algorithm and how it works, it is phenomenal. And, it's one of the benefits of technology. It's
groundbreaking.
It's groundbreaking. It really is.
And he should be recognized. This guy should be testifying in front of Congress. The House Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, the DOJ, they should be listening to what this guy has created and what he has to say.
I completely agree. And on that point, I know he speaks frequently with the FBI, but I'm like, can we get this algorithm?
Well, the FBI has apparently not implemented any of his suggestions. It sounds a lot like the 9/11 Commission report where, we have 2,000 pages of recommendations. We're not going to take any of them or implement a single one, but hey.
Right. Because I'm like, this could be a tool that could be groundbreaking and life-changing. And how amazing would it be if we had technology that could help solve these serial murders and prevent them from happening? Because we know this cluster here in Gary, Indiana is linked to this cluster here in Chicago, Illinois. We know, we're talking, we're communicating. That's how you solve crimes. You can't, if you're so narrowly focused on just what's in front of you, how are you ever going to make sense of the murders that might be tied to your perp in your jurisdiction?
Especially in a place like Chicago where the homicide rate is just
astronomical.
Staggering. So you can understand why mistakes are made when the cops are overwhelmed and understaffed, and the homicide rate is just through the roof in a city like Chicago.
And I know many people who might tune in and maybe don't have a connection to Chicago or aren't from there might think, well, this is a really sad story, but how does it relate to me? I'm here to tell you it relates to you because I promise you it's happening in your community. I promise you that there are actually more serial murders and unconnected cases involving the same perp than we have any knowledge of. And Thomas Hargrove proves that with his algorithm. So it's something that you should be aware of. It's just something that it's not just about Chicago. This is a national problem.
Look at any major Massachusetts had a serial killer that was preying on women who were perhaps living in the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
New York,
LA. There's clusters in St. Louis. There's clusters. I mean,
there's clusters all over the country, which is why this is such an important case, because you have to pay attention, and we absolutely need the feds to do something, to use this algorithm to make sure that these clusters are investigated properly, because the locals can't do it. They don't have the jurisdictional right to go into Gary, Indiana and take a look at these cases. There's so much bureaucratic paperwork, and it's a nightmare, which is why it really is a federal issue. And I'm glad that the feds are taking notice because of your amazing podcast. Carly Sullivan, I think the world of you, Carly Sullivan. Yes. Roland. No, I love it. I love even saying that.
Oh, it slips off the tongue, right?
But it really does.
Takes a little bit of getting used to. But thank you so much, Michele. It was, as always, a pleasure to talk to you. You are absolutely one of a kind and a powerhouse. So thank you.
How can people find more about the podcast?
Yeah. So as you know, Michele mentioned, you can find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. In addition, I'm not on Twitter, but I have social media at official Carly Roland. I do respond there. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. I'd love to get any notes, feedback, just anything at all. I'm always here to talk to people who are tuning in. And like I said in episode 1, you never know. Maybe we will find some answers and leads from this. And that's what I'm really hoping. You never know.
Never know. Well, stay tuned. Episode 5, 6, 7. Must listen. And then we'll have a bonus episode. I'm Michele McPhee. She is Carly Sullivan Roland. I'd like to thank our amazing producers. We have Andrew Steiner and Joseph Downs.